grind. Take down the film watchers and nerds all at once. I am one of those.
Yo, what's up? That's my idea of energy at the start of a video. Look, I'm trying to grind out the last of these stats so I can get a final update done on our prospect database and finally get to actually looking at prospects, because I'll be honest with you, I found my Dynasty Crossroads t-shirt. It turns out my wife was using it as pajamas, and now it's safely protected once again. I am sitting here with my Dynasty Dummies mug. I am ready to play some Dynasty. And I just keep getting triggered by Dynasty content that's still focusing on the wrong thing. And I want to get back to talking about it, but we have all these prospects to get through. So here we are. We're going to talk about our tight end model. And also some things about tight ends that are relevant for drafting them, especially in Dynasty. That's worth keeping in mind no matter what you're looking at. So I'll try and kind of throw out a few of those things as well. But what's the model? I guess is the first question, especially as an amateur nerd myself, who doesn't understand most of it. I'll tell you what I know. As much of it as I do know, anyway. So, graph. I'm starting it out with grass, because people like grass, right? But I'm also getting... we've got a Patreon Discord now, and people are keeping me more and more honest, which is great motivation, but also, like, back off, nerd, you know? Alright, so what does this graph mean? Essentially, it's the predicted points per game over the first 3 years, the average. And even for tight end, the first 3 years is a pretty good indication of at least how their value is going to grow or shrink. Although their points tend to be a little bit delayed compared to other positions, especially running back. So, we're looking to predict a fair range of outcomes in terms of their average points per game of the first 3 seasons. It's not all going to come in the first season. What's their average? So, the R-squared score here at the top, this funny little orange number, that's essentially the main test you'll see run, especially in the Dynasty community, on how good anything is. I've got a comparison for you, something that's a little more visceral that might help put this in context. You can convert it into a percentage very easily just to keep track of it. So right now, this pre-draft model is scoring 25%. 25% of what? We'll get to it. So the prediction is running down on the bottom of the chart here, and the actual points per game is running on the y-axis up on the left. So essentially this orange line here, you see the way it's linear? It's one straight line. That's what makes that's why they call it linear regression. I feel so much smarter having figured that out. But that's what linear regression means. It's using multiple variables to try and predict the one using those variables. And this is the chart. It's plotting based on a sample of players from 2003 to 2018. So we have at least a 3-year sample. They have to have data, played a decent number of games in the NFL, and a decent number of games in college. So, for example, someone like Jimmy Graham, and that's a problem that you should always be aware of the tight end position. He only played 1 season. He doesn't really meet the game threshold. And so he's basically kicked out of it in terms of modeling, which is also why he tests slightly below average. He tests close to average because he was Jimmy Graham. So even in 1 year, he did pretty well. But the tight end position is difficult for a number of reasons. One, you've got a lot of wide receivers switching over in college and then into the NFL. Devin Funchess actually enters the sample of players using those thresholds, for example. So I have to kick him out manually because that's not who we're trying to find, right? So those are things you should know. And the blue dots here represent the players' scores, both on the pre-draft model and how they actually did in the NFL. So you see there's a lot of variance around that line. If they were all very tightly packed around that orange line, we basically would have solved the tight end position. Quick tip, if you ever see a graph posted like that, I solve prospect evaluation, they have overfitted it, which is a nice way of saying they're cheating and they probably don't know what they're doing. Ignore it. Come at me, nerd, you know? But yeah, no, we're not going to get there with current data, at least. At least current things have been tracked for the last 20 years. So the best we're going to get is better data over a recent sample size if they ever start tracking air yards, maybe. But for now, we do the best we can, especially without the combine this year and everything else. So I've refitted all my pre-draft models to include some conference and team adjustment metrics that we've recently produced in the prospect database, pinned to my timeline, and also the Patreon timeline for free for all of us. So all of us get to play nerd, not just the super duper nerds, right? That's the idea behind it. So That's what it looks like if you put the tight end model I just created, which you can ignore because I created it. Create your own. That's the whole idea. But the best I can come up with is this. Or the best I can come up with while rushing to get back to Dynasty content, at least. All the p-values, if you get really nerdy, are over the 95% threshold. They all show statistic relevance. The adjusted R is pretty close to saying that it's outside the realm of possibility that it's actually chance. The stats... I was actually surprised the stats that it wanted to use. It kicked most things out on the basis of the probability value. Translation, they were likely not significant towards the result. That's how I understand the probability value. The probability that actually has relevance towards the actual result, the y-axis, or the points per game we're actually trying to predict. The things that it liked at tight end were not the stats I usually look at, mainly when prospecting tight ends. Interesting, no? It used sex, which is a Zach Reed metric, because he wanted to call something sex, which is actually the share of yards, or the percentage of the yards player produced for his team in his conference using a 5-year history of the conference average as the leading percentage of yards getter for that team. That was a weird way of saying that, but it's written down in the database just in case you wanted to see it written normally like a human being would say. It also used last year yards per team attempt, not passing attempt, which tends to work better for wide receiver. I felt that was interesting. Even the running back model wanted to use yards per team pass attempt in the first year to see which players were getting early opportunity and therefore might be an indication that they are particularly skilled and coaches are trying to rush them onto the field, at least in some capacity. If they're efficient with it, that's probably a good sign. This just wanted to use last year, and it wanted to use the share over conference expectation for a leading tight end over the last 5 years, which, again, is abbreviated to SEX because Zach Reed's a funny man, and also I thought it was funny. So that's what it wanted to use, as well as an intercept, which is just part of modeling. This is a picture it produces. Tight ends. Okay, so what does it do for the 2021 class is the next thing I guess it says. It puts Kyle Pitts at the top, and it does it significantly. He's scoring at an 8 points per game average of the first 3 years in the pre-draft model, if I can find it. Yeah, it's right there. To put this in context, the last player in the history going back to 2003 that this pre-draft model scored anyone at that range was Vernon Davis. Yeah, that's that. I would put good money that any player is not going to live up to that expectation. Especially when you consider the thing about Vernon Davis and the thing about the tight end position. While I rant and rave about how, a player's 3 inches or 2 inches or 1 second slower than you expect, and we're like, oh, well, they're not good at football. The thing about the tight end position is there's so many varied people that do well in the NFL after a short college season, like Jimmy Graham, he just played 1 year, or converted from basketball, as we all know the famous Antonio Gates did, or didn't play a full college career for one reason or another, that the sample is relatively poison. It's evidence from a poison tree. Is that a thing? No. Anyway, so it's relatively varied. So the fact that his pre-draft model compares him most directly to Vernon Davis going back 20 years makes us ask the question, is Kyle Pitts Vernon Davis? And I don't know. I don't have combine data to look at, but given the whispers I've heard about it on Twitter, I do not think he's one of the most athletic individuals to walk the face of the earth, which is basically Vernon Davis at a enormous size. Tight end our expectations should be adjusted for size at tight end, because that seems to be a way it works. I can rant and rave about how physical metrics are overrated at wide receiver, but they're slightly underrated at tight end. A good example is Gerald Everett. He was incredibly productive as a receiver in college playing at the tight end position, although I think he played wide receiver for a little while as well, and so he's some of the noise, like a Devin Funchess, and also Jalen Samuels, weirdly, in the tight end pool of college. He played kind of this hybrid role. So you have a lot of that noise going in. The fact that Kyle Pitts was as productive as Vernon Davis is a really good sign, but the fact he may well be the size of Gerald Everett gives you kind of the range of outputs that Kyle Pitts is kind of comparing, at least in my mind, to. The other thing I'd like to point out is the best stat, if I'm just going to look at a stat right now for tight end, which again is an incredibly hard position to read, but it's very easy to read in Dynasty, especially in terms of value. Basically, don't buy them this year, buy them next year. That's pretty much, they cost the same, and they're very unlikely to do anything in their first year. If so, they're Evan Ingram, and very few players actually break out in their first year, and we know that Evan Ingram value also eventually went down, to the point right now you can buy him cheap. Same with Hunter Henry for that matter. So yeah, I mostly don't buy tight ends early in Dynasty is my best advice, and do that with running backs. Come in on tight ends third year, come in on wide receivers second year is my basic rule. So Kyle Pitts isn't going to be Vernon Davis, which more puts him in the Gerald Everett category. But because of the 2020 season, I want to point out the main stat that I look at, which is where I started this sentence about an hour ago, is efficiency score. It's actually a new one I put in, but it's actually scoring the best single stat in terms of ranking a class. And very few stats do a decent job of ranking classes. This does specifically for tight end. So the efficiency score is the yards per team pass attempt above conference expectation over the last 5 years. Similar average, you might notice, to the sex score, but instead of looking at percentage of yards, it's looking at yards per team pass attempt, which is a better metric on its whole for describing how efficient and how much of a role they had in any given situation. So that efficiency score actually has a raw R squared score, just looking at everyone in the database, which isn't a good sample at all, but of like 18%. Very few stats get up that high, especially without whittling down the sample size to a decent group of players. So it's actually fairly efficient. I've dug through it. Jimmy Graham does okay, but he's the only notable tight end on the list for the last 20 years that wasn't at least positive that I can find, at least. You might find another example when you dig through it, because I didn't look at everyone, for goodness sake. In the last 20 years. So that's a pretty positive indication to me. There was also a lot of players that didn't do nothing in the NFL that have a positive score. So it's not perfect. That's why we want to pay attention to draft capital, size, and athleticism with tight end especially as well. But the interesting thing about sorry, it's on this side for you, but it's on that side for me. It's weird. Let me skip over to it so you can actually see it on the screen here. This one. To see the number of players with a positive score at the top of the pre-draft, because this is ordered by the pre-draft score, 1 to a billion, and all these players with little blue bars in the efficiency score category, that is highly unusual. Going back through past classes, very few players score well in the pre-draft model, so they were productive compared to previous players, and efficient compared to past players that were good in the NFL based on a conference average. Now that to me says that the last year was 2020, and the last year was freaking weird, and so that might be playing merry hell with the efficiency score, and we have more players looking efficient at the tight end position than we typically do. So we need a lot more context. I need to know roughly what size these guys are without combine stats, and also how athletic they are, really to evaluate them. But mostly I have a slow burn at tight end. I'm not overly eager to target any of them this year, so I don't feel like I'm in much of a rush. You can also see next to that, slightly peeking out, this comparison to hits. That's comparing the percentage difference, essentially, of players to players who are successful in the NFL, at least one top 12 season. It's a thing I'm working on. It's in all the tabs right now when I finally update it all. I hopefully I'll get it done before I update, but right now it's kind of experimentary. And you can see that a smaller number of players are actually comparing positively, and that's using their overall stats instead of last year's stats. And so I think that's probably a pretty good indication that we're getting a lot of noise. This is the first time I've really seen any indication that 2020 is having a large effect, and that's mostly because at the running back position we use best year, or I primarily use best year and average. Wide receiver I almost exclusively find the average is best, or the best stat, although the model itself does like to adjust by best and last year in some cases for certain stats. But tight end specifically, it almost always comes down to the last year. Again, where most tight ends typically play 1 year, which is also their last year. Everyone has a last year score, and the average tends to be skewed. So I think 2020 actually may be playing merry hell with the tight end class in 2021. But I can't, having looked through Kyle Pitts' stats, the only possible red flag he was very productive, definitely productive enough we should be uber interested in him. I think I've heard his name, that's why I'm talking like we all know who he is, but I'm pretty sure he's the one we think in this. I should watch college sometime, but yeah, there we go. So he looks fairly interesting. It's also interesting that he's coming from a conference, the SEC East, that has a pretty good hit rate or good history of tight ends actually being drafted from that conference and hitting in the NFL. If we just do a quick search for the SEC East, I haven't done this yet, so I'll do it live, as it were. Albert O from last year actually came from the same conference, although obviously Missouri instead of Florida. The last time we had a first-round draft pick, it was Hayden Hurst, which isn't a great look, to be fair. But he was productive. He was just not it. Mike Andrews tested better in that class for me. We're getting a lot of draft capital, usually in the 3rd and 4th round. Jordan Reed came from this conference, although that was a while ago. So interestingly enough, the SEC East has been a pretty good conference for tight ends, but it's been a fair while since a good one came from there, and that was Jordan Reed. Back in 2000, blah, 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 I forget. But you just saw it on the screen, so there you go. So he's coming from an interesting conference. He's got good production scores. I think the concern I would have on him is, one, tight ends don't produce in year one. And secondly, I don't know how big he is, and that's actually fairly relevant for the tight end position. I think... And the reason I rant and rave about size and combine metrics for wide receivers all the time, the fact being small doesn't matter and we need a small guy scoring all this stuff, tight end's an entirely different position. If that alone doesn't tell you it, that we're paying attention to physical metrics for a guy who literally ignores them for every other position, then I don't know what will. Main thing to think in terms of prospecting with tight ends is it's not different wide receiver. It's not. It's a very, very different position. I don't understand how. Look at me. I'm a nerdy little guy sitting in a basement. I don't know how to play tight end or wide receiver. But based on the pattern of who hits and who does well and who produces, you have to be a different kind of animal at wide receiver and at tight end to succeed at both. It's a relatively rare combination, like someone like Mark Ingram, who's pretty close to the size thresholds and did pretty well prospecting as both a wide receiver and a tight end. So pretty much players like TJ Hawkinson, Noah Fant, who hit this year, and we said were the most likely to hit this year, this offseason, going into the 2020 season, they're what we're looking for. Not guys who are uber productive like a Vernon Davis or a Kyle Pitts, but guys who are very productive in their situation considering they're a tight end who are just kind of built like tight ends. That's normally who I would target if I'm targeting them. I don't know if Kyle Pitts, Trey McBride, Brevin Jordan or Cade Otton actually profile that way just yet, but I can say that they're the most productive for a tight end in this class, even with some 2020 variants that seems to be inflating their efficiency score. Alright, that's where I'm at. That's where I'm at the tight end position. I have to dig into all these players more in depth. I have to finish up my wide receiver model. I've done a running back model video, a tight end model video. We're going to do a wide receiver model video. Then we're going to start ranking, and then maybe I'll get to start pointing out that all this dynasty content is just angled the right way. Just, if in case you're still here and you want to know the secret to dynasty, the point is to win. I don't know why, but most dynasty content forgets to point that out. If you're not winning, there's literally no point in playing, so build a roster that wins, not one that has value. Value is used to buy wins. That's it. I'm just fitting it in here because I'm really we'll get back there. Anyway, I'm gone. Hopefully you enjoy this. If not, leave a comment, tell me I'm a nerd. It's true. Hit me up on Twitter at Pahowdy and own me there too. I live for it. I enjoy it. I really appreciate all of you guys, especially the Discord, which is literally keeping me grinding right now because models are not fun to make for a fake nerd, at least. So I appreciate that, and I'll talk to you next time. Take care. That was me trying to be cool. I'm done. See you later. Bye.
Do you have